The big fellows. Boxing with the naked eye. Watching a fight on television has always seemed to me a poor substitute for being there. For one thing, you can't tell the fighters what to do. When I watch a fight, I like to study one boxer's problem, solve it, and then communicate my solution vocally. On occasion, my advice is disregarded, as when I tell a man to stay away from the other fellow's left, and he doesn't. But in such cases, I assume that he hasn't heard my counsel, or that his opponent has and has acted on it. Some fighters hear better and are more suggestible than others. For example, the pre-television Joe Louis. "Let him have it, Joe," I would yell whenever I saw him fight, and sooner or later he would let the other fellow have it. Another fighter like that was the late Marcel Cerdan, whom I would coach in his own language to prevent opposition seconds from picking up our signals. "Vas-y, Marcel," I used to shout, and Marcel always y allait. I get a feeling of participation that way that I don't in front of a television screen. I could yell, of course, but I would know that if my suggestion was adopted, it would be by the merest coincidence. Besides, when you go to a fight, the boxers aren't the only ones you want to be heard by. You are surrounded by people whose ignorance of the ring is exceeded only by their unwillingness to face facts. The sharpness of your boxer's punching, for instance. Such people may take it upon themselves to disparage the principle you are advising. This disparagement is less generally addressed to the man himself, as in, "Gavelin, you're a bum," than to his opponent, whom they have wrong-headedly picked to win. "He's a cream puff, Miss Lee," they may typically cry. "He can't hurt you, he can't hurt nobody. Look, slaps! Ha-ha!" They thus get at your man, and by indirection at you. To put them in their place, you address neither them nor their man, but your man. "Get the other eye, Gavelin," you cry. This throws them off balance, because they haven't noticed anything the matter with either eye. Then, before they can think of anything to say, you thunder, "Look at that eye!" It doesn't much matter whether or not the man has been hit in the eye. He will be. Addressing yourself to the fighter when you want somebody else to hear you is a parliamentary device, like, "Mr. Chairman." Before television, a prize fight was to a New Yorker the nearest equivalent to the New England town meeting. It taught a man to think on his seat. Less malignant than rooters for the wrong side, but almost as disquieting, are those who are on the right side but tactically unsound. At a moment when you have steered your boxer to a safe lead on points but can see the other fellow is still dangerous, one of these maniacs will encourage recklessness. "Finish the jerk, Harry," he will sing out. "Stop holding him up. Don't lose him." But you, knowing the enemy is a puncher, protect your client's interests. "Move to your left, Harry," you call. Keep moving, don't let him set." I sometimes finish a fight like that in a cold sweat. If you go to a fight with a friend, you can keep up unilateral conversations on two vocal levels, one at the top of your voice, directed at your fighter, and the other a running expertise, nominally aimed at your companion, but loud enough to reach a modest 15 feet in each direction. "Reminds me of Panama Al Brown," you may say as a new fighter enters the ring. "He was 5 feet 11 and weighed 118 pounds. This fellow may be about 40 pounds heavier and a couple of inches shorter, but he's got the same kind of neck. I saw Brown box a fellow named Mascar in Paris in 1927. Guy stood up in the top gallery and threw an apple and hit Brown right on the top of the head. The whole house started yelling, 'Finish him, Mascar, he's groggy.' Then, as the bout begins, boxes like Al, too, except this fellow's a southpaw. If he wins, you say, 'I told you he reminded me of Al Brown.' And if he loses, 'Well, I guess he's no Al Brown. They don't make fighters like Al anymore.' This identifies you as a man who, A, has been in Paris, B, has been going to fights for a long time, and C, therefore enjoys what the fellows who write for quarterlies call a frame of reference. It may be argued that this doesn't get you anywhere, but it at least constitutes what a man I once met named Thomas S. Matthews called communication. Mr. Matthews, who was the editor of Time, said that the most important thing in journalism is not reporting, but communication. "What are you going to communicate?" I asked him. "The most important thing," he said, "is the man on one end of the circuit saying, 'My God, I'm alive, you're alive,' and the fellow on the other end receiving his message saying, 'My God, you're right, we're both alive.' I still think it is a hell of a way to run a news magazine, but it is a good reason for going to fights in person. Television, if unchecked, may carry us back to a pre-tribal state of social development, when the family was the largest conversational unit. Fights are also a great place for adding to your repertory of witty sayings. I shall not forget my adolescent delight when I first heard a fight fan yell, "I hope yous boat gets knocked out." I thought he had made it up, although I found out later it was a cliché. It is a formula adaptable to an endless variety of situations outside the ring. The only trouble with it is it never works out. The place where I first heard the line was Bill Brown's, a fight club in a big shed behind a trolley station in Far Rockaway. On another night there, the time for the main bout arrived, and one of the principals hadn't. The other fighter sat in the ring, a bantamweight with a face like a well-worn coin, and the fans stamped in cadence and whistled and yelled for their money back. It was 30 years before television, but there were only a couple of hundred men on hand. The preliminary fights had been terrible. The little fighter kept looking at his hands, which were resting on his knees in cracked boxing gloves, and every now and then he would spit on the mat and rub the spittle into the canvas with one of his scuffed ring shoes. The longer he waited, the more frequently he spat, and I presumed he was worrying about the money he was supposed to get. It wouldn't be more than $50 with a house that size, even if the other man turned up. He had come there from some remote place like West or East New York, and he may have been thinking about the last train home on the Long Island Railroad, too. Finally, the other bantamweight got there, looking out of breath and flustered. He had lost his way on the railroad, changed to the wrong train at Jamaica, and had to go back there and start over. The crowd booed so loud that he looked embarrassed. When the fight began, the fellow who had been waiting walked right into the new boy and knocked him down. He acted impatient. The tardy fellow got up and fought back gamely, but the one who had been waiting nailed him again, and the latecomer just about pulled up to one knee at the count of 7. He had been hit pretty hard, and you could see from his face that he was wondering whether to chuck it. Somebody in the crowd yelled out, "Hey, Hickey, you kept us all waiting, why don't you stay around a while?" So the fellow got up and caught for 10 rounds and probably made the one who had come early miss his train. It's another formula with multiple applications, and I think the man who said it that night in Far Rockaway did make it up. Because of the way I feel about watching fights on television, I was highly pleased when I read, back in June 1951, that the 15-round match between Joe Louis and Lee Savold, scheduled for June 13th at the Polo Grounds, was to be neither televised, except to 8 theater audiences in places like Pittsburgh and Albany, nor broadcast over the radio. I hadn't seen Louis with the naked eye since we shook hands in a pub in London in 1944. He had fought often since then, and I had seen his 2 bouts with Jersey Joe Walcott on television, but there hadn't been any fun in it. Those had been held in public places, naturally, and I could have gone, but television gives you so plausible an adumbration of a fight for nothing that you feel it would be extravagant to pay your way in. It is like the potato, which is only a succedaneum for something decent to eat, but which, once introduced into Ireland, proved so cheap that the peasants gave up their grain and meat diet in favor of it. After that, the landlords let them keep just enough money to buy potatoes. William Cobbett, the great Englishman, said that he would sack any workman of his he caught eating one of the cursed things, because as soon as potatoes appeared anywhere, they brought down the standard of eating. I sometimes think of Cobbett on my way home from the races, looking at the television aerials on all the little houses between here and Belmont Park. As soon as I heard that the fight wouldn't be on the air, I determined to buy a ticket. On the night of the 13th, the Wednesday, it rained, and on the next night it rained again, so on the evening of June 15th, the promoters, the International Boxing Club, confronted by a night game at the Polo Grounds, transferred the fight to Madison Square Garden. The postponements upset a plan I had to go to the fight with a friend who had another date for the 3rd night, but alone is a good way to go to a fight or the races because you have more time to look around you, and you always get all the conversation you can use anyway. I went to the Garden box office early Friday afternoon and bought a $10 seat in the side arena, the first tiers rising in back of the boxes, midway between 8th and 9th Avenues on the 49th Street side of the house. There was only a scattering of ticket buyers in the lobby, and the man at the ticket window was polite, a bad omen for the gate. After buying the ticket, I got into a cab in front of the Garden, and the driver naturally asked me if I was going to see the fight. I said I was, and he said, "He's all through." I knew he meant Lewis, and I said, "I know, and that's why it may be a good fight. If he weren't through, he might kill this guy." The driver said, "Savold is a hooker. He breaks noses." I said he couldn't break his own nose even, and then began to wonder how a man would go about trying to do that. "It's a shame he's so hard up he had to fight at all at his age," I said, knowing the driver would understand I meant Lewis. I was surprised that the driver was against Lewis, and I was appealing to his better feelings. "He must have plenty socked away," said the driver. "Playing golf for $100 a hole." "Maybe that helped him go broke," I said. "And anyway, what does that prove? There's many a man with a small salary who bets more than he can afford." I had seen a scratch sheet on the seat next to the hackey. I was glad I was riding only as far as Brentano's with him. The driver I had on the long ride home was a better type. As soon as I told him I was going to the fight, which was at about the same time that he dropped the flag, he said, "I guess the old guy can still sock." I said, "I saw him murder Max Baer 16 years ago. He was a sweet fighter then." The driver said, 16 years is a long time for a fighter. I don't remember anybody lasted 16 years in the big money. Still, Savold is almost as old as he is. When you're a bum, nobody notices how old you get." We had a pleasant time on the West Side Highway, talking about how Harry Greb had gone on fighting when he was blind in one eye, only nobody knew it but his manager, and how Pete Herman had been the best in-fighter in the world because he had been practically blind in both eyes, so he couldn't afford to fool around outside. "What Herman did, you couldn't learn a boy now," the driver said. "They got no patience." The fellow who drove me from my house to the garden after dinner was also a man of goodwill, but rather different. He knew I was going to the fight as soon as I told him my destination, and once we had got under way, he said, "It is a pity that a man like Lewis should be exploited to such a degree that he has to fight again." It was only 9:15, and he agreed with me that I had plenty of time to get to the garden for the main bout, which was scheduled to begin at 10. But when we got caught in unexpectedly heavy traffic on 11th Avenue, he grew impatient. "Come on, Jersey," he said, giving a station wagon in front of us the horn. In the last analysis, we have got to get to the garden sometime. But it didn't help much, because most of the other cars were heading for the garden, too. The traffic was so slow going toward 8th Avenue on 50th Street that I asked him to let me out near the garden corner and joined the people hurrying from the Independent subway exit toward the garden marquee. A high percentage of them were from Harlem, and they were dressed as if for a levee, the men in shimmering gabardines and felt hats the color of freshly unwrapped chewing gum, the women in spring suits and fur pieces. It was a cool night, and what seemed to me the prettiest hats of the season. They seemed to me the prettiest lot of women I had seen in a long time, too, and I reflected that if the fight had been televised, I would have missed them. "Step out," I heard one beau say as his group swept past me, "or we won't maybe get in. It's just like I told you, he's still one hell of a draw." As I made my way through the now crowded lobby, I could hear the special cop next to the ticket window chanting, 6, 8, 10, and $15 tickets only, which meant that the $2.50 general admission and $20 ringside seats were sold out. It made me feel good because it showed there were still some gregarious people left in the world. Inside the garden there was the same old happy drone of voices as when Jimmy McLarnin was fighting and Jimmy Walker was at the ringside. There was only one small patch of bare seats, in a particularly bad part of the ringside section. I wondered what sort of occupant I would find in my seat. I knew from experience that there would be somebody in it. It turned out to be a small, frail colored man in wine-red livery. He sat up straight and pressed his shoulder blades against the back of the chair so I couldn't see the number. When I showed him my ticket, he said, "I don't know nothing about that. You better see the usher." He was offering this token resistance, I knew, only to protect his self-esteem, to maintain the shadowy fiction that he was in the seat by error. When an usher wandered within hailing distance of us, I called him, and the little man left to drift to some other part of the garden, where he had no reputation as a $10 seat holder to lose, and there to squat contentedly on a step. My seat was midway between the east and west ends of the ring, and about 15 feet above it. Two not very skillful colored boys were finishing a 4-rounder that the man in the next seat told me was an emergency bout, put on because there had been several knockouts in the earlier preliminaries. It gave me a chance to settle down and look around. It was 10 o'clock by the time the colored boys finished, and the man with the microphone announced the decision, but there was no sign of Lewis or Savold. The fight wasn't on the air, so there was no need of the punctuality required by the radio business. Later I read in the newspapers that the bout had been delayed in deference to the hundreds of people who were still in line to buy tickets and who wanted to be sure of seeing the whole fight. Nobody made any spiel about beer as on the home screen, although a good volume of it was being drunk all around. Miss Gladys Gooding, an organist, played the national anthem and a tenor sang it, and we all applauded. After that, the announcer introduced a number of less than illustrious prize fighters from the ring, but nobody whistled or acted restless. It was a good-natured crowd. Then Lewis and his seconds, what the author of Boxiana would have called his faction, appeared from a runway under the north stands and headed toward the ring. The first thing I noticed from where I sat was that the top of Lewis's head was bald. He looked taller than I had remembered him, although surely he couldn't have grown after the age of 30, and his face was puffy and impassive. It has always been so. In the days of his greatness, the press read menace in it. He walked stiff-legged, as was natural for a man of 37, but when his seconds pulled off his dressing robe, his body looked all right. He had never been a lean man. His muscles had always been well buried beneath his smooth beige skin. I recalled the first time I had seen him fight, against Bear. That was at the Yankee Stadium in September 1935, and not only the great ballpark, but the roofs of all the apartment houses around were crowded with spectators, and hundreds of people were getting out of trains at the elevated IRT station, which overlooks the field, and trying to loiter long enough to catch a few moments of action. Lewis had come east that summer, after a single year as a professional, and had knocked out Primo Carnera in a few rounds. Carnera had been the heavyweight champion of the world in 1934 when Bear knocked him out. Bear, when he fought Lewis, was the most powerful and gifted heavyweight of the day, although he had already fumbled away his title. But this mature Bear, who had fought everybody, was frightened stiff by the 21-year-old mulatto boy. Lewis outclassed him. The whole thing went only 4 rounds. There hadn't been anybody remotely like Lewis since Dempsey in the early 20s. The week of the Lewis-Bear fight, a man I know wrote in a magazine, "With half an eye one can observe that the town is more full of stir than it has been in many moons. It is hard to find a place to park, hard to get a table in a restaurant, hard to answer all the phone calls. Economic seers can explain it, if you care to listen. We prefer to remember that a sudden inflation of the town's spirit can be just as much psychological or accidental as economic." I figured it was Lewis. Savold had now come up into the other corner, a juddy-jawed man with a fair skin but a red back, probably sunburned at his training camp. He was 20 pounds lighter than Lewis, but that isn't considered a crushing handicap among heavyweights. Ezzard Charles, who beat Lewis the previous year, was 10 pounds lighter than Savold. Savold was 35, and there didn't seem to be much bounce in him. I had seen him fight twice in the winter of 1946, and I knew he wasn't much. Both bouts had been against a young Negro heavyweight named Al Hoosman, a tall, skinny fellow just out of the Army. Hoosman had started well the first time, but Savold had hurt him with body punches and won the decision. The second time, Hoosman had stayed away and jabbed him silly. An old third-rater like Savold, I knew, doesn't improve with 5 more years on him. But an old third-rater doesn't rattle easily either, and I was sure he'd do his best. It made me more apprehensive in one way than if he'd been any good. I wouldn't have liked to see Lewis beaten by a good young fighter, but it would have been awful to see him beaten by a clown. Not that I have anything against Savold, I just think it's immoral for a fellow without talent to get too far. A lot of others in the crowd must have felt the same way because the house was quiet when the fight started, as if the Lewis rooters didn't want to ask too much of Joe. There weren't any audible rooters for Savold, though of course there would have been if he had landed one good punch. I remembered reading in a newspaper that Savold had said he would walk right out and bang Lewis in the temple with a right, which would scramble his thinking. But all he did was come forward, as he had against Hoosman, with his left low. A fellow like that never changes. Lewis walked out straight and stiff-legged and jabbed his left into Savold's face. He did it again and again, and Savold didn't seem to know what to do about it. And Lewis jabs a lot harder than a fellow like Hoosman. Lewis didn't have to chase Savold, and he had no reason to run away from him either, so the stiff legs were all right. When the two men came close together, Lewis jarred Savold with short punches, and Savold couldn't push him around, so that was all right too. After the first round, the crowd knew Lewis would win if his legs would hold him. In the second round, Lewis began hitting Savold with combinations, quick sequences of punches, like a right under the heart and a left hook to the right side of the head. A sports writer I know had told me that Lewis hadn't been putting combinations together for several fights back. Combinations demand a superior kind of coordination, but a fighter who has once had that can partly regain it by hard work. A couple of times it looked as if Lewis was trying for a knockout, but when Savold didn't come apart, Lewis returned to jabbing. A man somewhere behind me kept saying to a companion, "I read Savold was a tricky fighter. He's got to do something." But Savold didn't until late in the fifth round, by which time his head must have felt like a sick music box. Then he threw a right to Lewis's head, and it landed. I thought I could see Lewis shrink as if he feared trouble. His response 10 years ago would have been to tear right back into the man. Savold threw another right, exactly the same kind, and that hit Lewis too. No good fighter should have been hit twice in succession with that kind of foolish punch. But the punches weren't hard enough to slow Lewis down, and that was the end of that. In the third minute of the sixth round, he hit Savold with a couple of combinations no harder than those that had gone before, but Savold was weak now. His legs were going limp, and Lewis was pursuing him as he backed toward my side of the ring. Then Lewis swung like an axeman with his right. He wasn't snapping it as he used to, and his left dropped over Savold's guard and against his jaw, and the fellow was rolling over and over on the mat, rolling the way football players do when they fall on a fumbled ball. The referee was counting, and Savold was rolling, and he got up on either 9 or 10, I couldn't tell which. Later I read that it was 10, so he was out officially. But you could see he was knocked silly, and the referee had his arms around him, and it was over. The newspaper men, acres of them near the ring, were banging out the leads for the running stories they had already telegraphed, and I felt sorry for them because they never have time to enjoy boxing matches. Since the fight was not broadcast, there was no oily-voiced chap to drag Lewis over to a microphone and ask him stupid questions. He shook hands with Savold twice, once right after the knockout and again a few minutes later when Savold was ready to leave the ring, as if he feared Savold wouldn't remember the first handshake. I drifted toward the lobby with the crowd. The chic Harlem people were saying to one another, "It was terrific, darling, it was terrific." I could see that an element of continuity had been restored to their world. But there wasn't any of the wild exultation that had followed those first Lewis victories in 1935. These people had celebrated so many times, except, of course, the younger ones who were small children when Lewis knocked out Bear. I recognized one of the Gardner promoters, usually a sour fellow, looking happy. The bout had brought in receipts of $94,684, including my $10. But what was more important to the Gardner, Lewis was sure to draw a lot more the next time, and at the higher scale of prices. I walked downtown on 8th Avenue to a point where the crowd began to thin out and climbed into a taxi that had been stopped by the light on a cross street. This one had a Negro driver. "The old fellow looked pretty good tonight," I said. "Had those combinations going." "Fight over?" the driver asked. If there had been television or even radio, he would have known about everything, and I wouldn't have had the fun of telling him. "Sure," I said. "He knocked the guy out in the sixth." "I was afraid he wouldn't," said the driver. "You know, it's a funny thing," he said after we had gone on away, "but I've been 25 years in New York now and never seen Joe Louis in the flesh." "You've seen him on television, haven't you?" "Yeah," he said, "but that don't count." After a while he said, "I remember when he fought Carnera, the celebration in Harlem. They poisoned his mind before that fight, his managers and Jack Blackburn did. They told him Carnera was Mussolini's man and Mussolini started the Ethiopian War. He cut that man down like he was a tree."